Hi, it's Steve Hassan, and I am delighted to have on with me my mentor, Robert J. Lifton, psychiatrist. This is his latest of so many books. The last time we talked, Robert, was when this book came out in October. I'll read the title Losing Reality on Cults, Cultism, and the Mindset of Political and Religious Zealotry. And I really like this volume because it's small, but it's a summary of so many of your vital ideas for people
Yes.
who haven't read, like I have, all of your books, which I am guilty of. So I understand you're at Wellfleet now, and I want to talk to you about your thoughts on Donald Trump, the COVID pandemic, racism and policing, and then anything else you might like to share your wisdom on. So you can decide what you'd like to start with, whatever
Well,
flows.
the things you mentioned are let me say nothing small.
Right, of course. And we're
Uh,
gonna,
if we start from where we are
yep.
with COVID-19, one way of looking psychologically at what's going on, which is so powerful and moving, is a struggle for reality about racism. And from racism, it extends to oppression of any kind. And that's one way to look at the protests. Uh, they're more than just temporary protests, there's something historical going on. And they take shape from the concrete images of Black people being killed by police.
Hmm.
One can say murdered by police. And in that sense, there's a concrete reality about racism that they insist that the country and the world recognize. And I think it's up to us as psychiatrists and psychologists to look at what this entails in terms of our minds. Um, they frequently invoke uh, James Baldwin, and Baldwin was very focused on making known the historical truths about Black experience in this country from slavery on. And it's that kind of focus on truth and reality that I think the protesters have picked up. And this protest movement, in a sense, involves everything because there are parallel reality struggles going on, and of course they have to do with the virus itself, because the effort on the part of Trump and his followers is sometimes to be a heroic combatant against this terrible virus, but more frequently to try to dismiss it and pretend that it hasn't occurred and that it doesn't exist now, as he wants to open the country in the service of his election credentials. So there's a struggle for reality there, and the protests involving racism and oppression connect directly with the virus because, as we know, Black and minority deaths are disproportionately large in connection with the virus. So what we're seeing is moving, and I think we psychologists have a task, and I'm trying to now write about this and think about it and talk about it in various podcasts, uh, how the struggle for the reality of racism and oppression connects with the struggle for reality in relation to the virus and also in relation to climate change, and indeed, even nuclear weapons. So all can be seen as converging
Hmm.
in this all important struggle for reality and then taking appropriate steps about changing the situation of reality. That's in a nutshell where I am now, and it's a kind of continuation from where I left off in that
Right.
book, that last book so far, Losing Reality.
Right. So, part of the Trump movement is about questioning science, questioning experts, de- de- deconstructing institutions and people's trust in institutions. Like why put someone in charge of the EPA who doesn't believe in the EPA's mission, right? Can you talk about a little bit
Yes.
about the attack on science?
I, I've been interested in Trump for some time in relation to what I call his solipsistic reality, meaning the reality that comes solely from the individual self, its experiences, and its needs. Uh, and in that sense, he can, of course, dismiss all authorities, dismiss science, dismiss evidence. That becomes what is called alternate reality. It is fundamentally a rejection of the reality of now the COVID virus. And this has been a crucial moment for Trump and for the rest of us because the virus is organic and physical. It causes illness and death, and it suffuses the atmosphere with death and death anxiety in all of us. None of us is immune from it. Because of that organic, physical, deadly element, Trump's ordinarily manipulative efforts with his solipsistic reality cannot work. They've only worked in part, and there have been various struggles where he could seem to create an alternate narrative that could contain his lies or, in a way, avoid many of his followers paying attention to his lies. But the alternate narrative becomes much more problematic in relation to the COVID-19 virus with its physicality and its death anxiety. And that has caused a crisis for Trump. Uh, I would call it a vicious circle in which he finds that more and more his alternate reality is rejected. When that happens, he becomes more anxious and more extreme in his lies and in his behavior. Uh, and that in turn causes more of his ideas and alternate reality to be further rejected in this vicious circle. Uh, that is a hopeful sign, a very hopeful sign. But there is, at the same time, the powerful, the strong danger of his doing extremely destructive things and taking stands that are harmful to the society even more than what he's done. And that will be extremely difficult to overcome, even if he is removed from office.
Uh-huh. And I want to just, for those who don't know this, you wrote the foreword, if I'm remembering correctly, of the volume, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, that Dr. Bandy Lee, forensic psychiatrist and expert on dangerousness, helped to edit with, I think, 36 other experts and mental health professionals. Um,
Yes, and in that, and so that was the early effort on the part of psychiatrists and psychologists to speak out about Trump without making any claim, and in fact rejecting the idea of a hands-on diagnosis. It wasn't that at all. It was pointing to certain psychological traits
right.
in Trump that were deeply dangerous. And in that forward, what I emphasized was what I called malignant normality.
Mm.
And it's something we've had to, I got the idea from Nazi Germany, where it was the expected behavior of Nazi doctors at the ramp to select Jews for the gas chamber. That was their job. So that was the malignant normality of the Nazi regime. Trump is not a Nazi, but there's a malignant normality that he and his followers promulgate in this country. and it has to do with lies and false narratives, and in this case, with causing a large number of additional deaths from the virus because of his mistreatment of it and negation of it. So in that forward, I wrote about the malignant normality that Trump brings to this society and that we have been living with, and the function of what I call witnessing professionals, professionals who look at that malignant normality, expose it, and take a stand against it. And that's what those of us writing about it were trying to do. And that's what I know you're trying to do in your work, and so are many others. But it just gives a framework and a
Sure.
name for
Yeah.
what you are doing. And it becomes right now as important as ever to keep with that witnessing commitment and the commitment to combat the
Right.
malignant normality that we're faced with.
And Dr. Lee talks, primarily about duty to warn that if you see somebody acting dangerously, it's your duty to tell. Hey, there's somebody who's walking down the street shooting guns randomly. It's your duty to warn. Call the police. Say there's somebody who's unstable. And that's kind of the posture here is her expertise of dangerousness.
It
She's
is.
and all of her predictions are coming true, and your predictions that this is going to get worse as he has more power.
Yeah, that's right. That was the original expectation, and unfortunately came all too true. The situation now has reached a kind of climax because, yes, he's using and misusing his power, but his power is not unlimited. And that's why we have a deep crisis all through the whole society. And we in psychological professions can approach that crisis from our perspective. It's not the only perspective, but it's a very important one. And we have to follow him. The question comes up, for instance, is he headed for a mental breakdown? Well,
Mm-hmm.
we don't know that, and I would be loath to predict that.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a reality breakdown, and
Mm-hmm.
that's important. That we are seeing and can state and describe. And after all, our psychological work has always to do with reality, even though there are different definitions and lots of conflict about what you consider reality. There's a way in which one can look at it. In fact, we distinguish between the large kind of um, abstract reality that any society lives with. The questions about whether democracy is the best form of government or whether God exists, or okay, those are abstract realities ever to be discussed. But then there is also the immediate factual reality.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I'm talking to you now in a Zoom event. Uh,
Right.
the COVID-19 virus is killing people, and we can name and identify the dead, even if Trump and followers try to suppress that information as they have. Uh, and
Even call it
what,
a hoax. I mean,
yes, that's right. They can call it a hoax. And some of Trump's followers at that rally last night um, said, well, who cares about, some said it was a hoax. Others said, I just don't worry about it. Anyhow, the president said it was okay. Uh, and incidentally, or not so incidentally, that's where the cultic element comes in as well. I don't think that Trump's movement can be defined as simply a cult, but it has all kinds of cultic tendencies. And
mm-hmm.
when he calls his followers uh, to come to a meeting where they expected, what, 20 to 100,000 people and got
Right.
6,000 instead of 6,200, nonetheless, he's calling them into a very dangerous situation. And I raise, it may seem a little extreme to suggest this point, but it's a little bit parallel to the People's Temple and Jim Jones, revolutionary suicide, except in this case, the revolutionary suicide was the Trump version of it was connected with a disclaimer.
Yeah.
Is
Sign the
you
disclaimer.
couldn't
You
sue
won't hold
some
us
campaign.
accountable. Right.
Uh, at least Jim Jones didn't make a disclaimer. Uh,
On cyanide lace Kool-Aid, right?
so now, of course, Trump didn't call upon these people to die, but he
Right.
called upon them to come into a very dangerous situation in which their life could be threatened and that of many other people around them and throughout the society since they came from various different states. And that's a kind of cultic leader calling upon his followers to do that kind, to perform that kind of sacrifice. Uh, I've said before, and I still believe it, all this, in many ways, it has backfired already,
Mm.
uh, but it could backfire further in the not only rejection of Trump, but attack on Trump on the part of former followers
Hmm.
when they find that the guru, the master, has not provided them what they wanted or needed
Right.
in the way of a follower.
Yeah,
Or
people are
has,
falling
like,
away now.
what's that?
People are falling away and realizing that he isn't who they wanted to believe he is. And unlike you, I have gone out further on a limb and called it a cult in the sense that not that everybody who voted on him are in a cult, but people who believe blindly, who will literally say, um, parrot the extreme black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil, conspiracy theory, stuff, and
Right.
who completely say Russia has no ill intent and no involvement in doing propaganda or disinformation campaigns, even though 11 of our intelligence agencies have all said, of course they have, and they're still doing it. But they're in
Yes.
total denial of it. And it seems like a cult to
That,
me.
so yes, so we agree that is cultic when they do that, a cult like. There's no doubt about it. Uh, and I invoke my study of Aum Shinrikyo, the fanatical Japanese cult, uh, and Shoko Asahara was a compelling, extreme guru in a lot of ways, and very apocalyptic. When he was uh, when he was revealed to be a criminal and put in prison and was an inmate rather than a guru, some of his most ardent followers turned angrily against him and called him a false guru and a bad human being and other things. And they included the most extreme followers.
Mm.
So, well, it's a different situation with Trump, and he doesn't have a single cultic community the way Asahara did with that extremity. Nonetheless, we're seeing some of them, as you say, falling off, and there could be more, and they might not only fall off, but become themselves attack dogs on him, just as he has attacked others.
Yeah, that's definitely possible, but then there's also my concern that they'll, continue after if he's no longer in power, they'll continue spinning, Trumpism and the need for civil war to happen in the US, which I think is Putin's agenda, and I would add China probably too, and maybe Iran, maybe ISIS also would like to see civil war in the streets of the United States because they'll be able to have more influence if
Well,
we're
you're right to worry about that. When I say some will turn against him, there'll be others who will reassert uh, his truths as they see it
Mhm.
and seek to struggle to bring about what he couldn't do. And uh, Trump has never been a completely isolated figure. He's connected with forces in the society, uh, extremely right-wing forces. The group that has been described as having paranoid tendencies and um, has always been opposed to elected authority, to science, to intellectual. They've been anti-intellectual, and these are really powerful forces in this society that he has evoked and stimulated. He didn't create them; they
Right.
long preceded him.
Right.
But that's why, let's assume that he's removed from office. That's only the beginning of the country's work, even in this effort to restore reality that I have been talking about.
Yep.
But of course, one has to remove him first in order to uh, fully, fully engage the effort of restoring reality. I think that could well happen, and there'll be lots of opposition. It's one reason, incidentally, why the military figures who have criticized Trump for politicizing the military,
Right.
uh, speaking
Millie.
out,
Hmm.
has great importance for what happens subsequently, because they will be important for defending the democracy when he's
Yes.
defeated.
Critically. So I would like to just put you on the spot, if I may, and we may pull out a short little segment of this interview. But there's so many former cult members who have read chapter 22 of Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, and they regard you as, the expert on thought reform and brainwashing. But they have fallen under the influence of Trumpism, and they think that he should be, they should have allegiance to him. We shouldn't question him. What might you say to former cult members who respect your work but still don't connect the dots with what we're seeing?
Well, one kind of emphasis in my recent book, which you mentioned, called Losing Reality, uh, is the relationship between political and religious extremism. And I call them both a form of cultism. And I think that former cult members, you can't necessarily do this simply by logic and by adding up 2 + 2 = 4, and they should see this.
Right.
But one has to give them examples, and one has to show them that both cults and Trump have attempted to own reality.
Mm-hmm.
Ideological totalists like Maoists, uh,
Mm-hmm.
which I describe in my Thought Reform book, uh,
Yes.
but also cult members who saw in chapter 22 that totalism that resembled what they had been through. These two groups try to own reality, and people coming out of cults need to learn to be suspicious and critical of any group that seeks to own reality. And
Mm-hmm.
that's, of course, why I listed those and described those so-called 8 deadly sins. They
Yes.
all have to do with owning reality, or that attempt to do so. But they also, I'm sure, as you have experience with as much as anyone, they also have to find a life that's an alternative to the cult life.
Yes.
Because, as you know, the life in a cult can be in many ways satisfying to people. It can solve many needs when
Mm-hmm.
they don't think about being controlled from the outside, but have their thoughts and their actions and their routines and behavior laid out for them
Yes.
uh, in a shared community. Of course, there are always conflicts, and it's never that smooth.
Right.
But there can be satisfactions in, and so when they leave cults, I think it's been problem for people working with them and for all of us uh, from the time all this began. When they leave cults, what kind of life can they find? It isn't simply going back to their families as things were before, because the world has changed, and it's changed especially for them.
Yes.
What kind of, it's a third place.
Yeah.
Um, Perhaps they become close to others who have had a similar experience or remain close to
Yeah.
others because they can share that experience. Uh, perhaps they have, perhaps they learn in a new way what it means to be free of control, free of outside control, uh, or autonomous,
Yeah.
and take on some of the conflicts of autonomy, one could say,
Yes.
of being able to do what one chooses and having to make those choices. I think, in a way, they probably need models of people who have made those choices. It
Definitely.
would seem that you yourself are one of them,
Yeah. Thank
and
you.
that you were involved many decades ago in the cult, but came to understand what it did, and with that knowledge, came to a very alternative view that you've helped share and influence, have influence on others. And those are some of the things I would
Yeah.
say to them, but those are things I think you've been practicing.
No, I appreciate that very much. And, one thing that's also changed over the decades is more people are coming out who are born into cults or authoritarian groups.
But they're coming out. What do you say? What
Coming
they're
out
coming
of,
out?
who are born into authoritarian cults or
Oh yes, yes.
groups.
Born
And
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 lived in
and
it.
for me,
Yeah,
I was
yeah,
19 when I was recruited into the Moonies, so and I was only 2.5 years, so I had a self to come back to and a family. But for those who were
yeah,
raised in an extremist group and didn't get
yeah, yeah.
educated, they have a much bigger struggle.
That's very hard. That's they don't know any other community.
Right.
I'm sure some of them have an exciting awakening, but others, I'm sure, are deeply conflicted
Yeah.
and have trouble finding their way. And that could be true of people who went through thought reform as well, though that was a larger movement encompassing a
Right.
whole country.
So I want to come back to Trump followers, if I may, and just acknowledge that while they minimize Russia as a nefarious mind control force, even though when I talk to ex-Russians, emigres, etc., and they talk about the system there under Putin and the propaganda, the Trumpers are very open to hearing about Chinese communist brainwashing, right? And that's another reason why I think your work is so potentially helpful to help Trumpers go, oh,
When you say that, when you say they're interested in hearing about Chinese communist brainwashing, are they critical of it or sympathetic to it, or
oh
do
no,
they
they're
vary?
critical of it. They're
Yeah,
critical of China, so there's media that talks about Chinese brainwashing programs currently, and for those who learn about your work studying communist brainwashing, I think there's a connection there that could be very powerful if they
yes.
can see the
It,
dots.
it, it could help people who have been followers of Trump recognize some of these tendencies in the Trump movement.
Yes,
It's of some it's of some interest then also that in these revelations by Bolton, Trump has apparently endorsed the treatment of Uyghurs in China, putting 1 million people in camps that carry through a very cruel version of thought reform, including a deculturalization and lots of violence against Uyghurs.
yeah,
And Trump apparently said that was fine for the Chinese to do that.
right.
So he hasn't given an endorsement to all of Chinese thought reform, but he certainly at least gave an okay to one of the worst expressions of it.
But that
And
was
that
that
should,
was more of an internal thing that Bolton revealed recently. But prior to that information, the general public position on China is they're evil and we got to stop them. You know, they're a threat to us, etc. And but communism is communism. I should also just jokingly add, I'm being accused of being in the cult of the left. That
I
I
see.
am unwittingly involved with communism and cultural Marxism and other left wing things, even though I write about left wing cults as much as I write about right wing cults. But
Right, right. You know, one important principle when I finished my book on thought reform, from everything I wrote, and even chapter 22 in its generalizations, a key message was this is not simply a Chinese communist project. I mean, it is that, but thought reform or thought reform like behavior can be embraced by anyone in different cultures. And there have always been aspects of that in American culture or in any other culture you can name. And one key that I've tried to emphasize is that of seeking to own reality.
yes,
And that's something one can really look at. And it isn't just the evil, quotes, the evil Chinese. It's any group that becomes totalistic and cultist and seeks to own reality. And of course, many people learn that, but for others, it's a really difficult truth for them
yeah.
to come to.
Yeah, and I know you wrote about doubling in your book on the Nazi doctors. I talk about the dual identity, like the Steve before the Moonies and the Mooney Steve were distinct different beings and such.
Yes.
Would you comment about your thoughts
Yes.
about that and dissociation if you care to mix a psychological concept in there?
Well, doubling is in a way a form of dissociation. Dissociation is the general term
Right.
for any separation of parts of the self. Uh, with doubling, I started out observing Nazi doctors, and Nazi doctors could do their work of selections and killing, in effect, in Auschwitz as their daily job, and then uh, go from Poland back to Germany for a weekend or leave for a few days with their families where they'd be ordinary fathers and husbands. So I came to call this doubling as though they formed two separate selves, although they were really elements of the same self.
Uh-huh.
Now, the doubling didn't work. It was a defense mechanism, a form of dissociation. Didn't work perfectly because things could come out or disturb them when they were on their time at home. Nonetheless, it was a protective mechanism. And with cults, as you know, and as you say in a similar way in your work, it's as if one has a mind and a mindset which is radically altered when one comes into a cult and one takes on a separate mind or mindset. But when one leaves it, there can be a partial return, even suddenly, to the prior one. So that, as I'm sure you've observed, sometimes during the court cases involving cult members, when the young person would move at the decision of the judge or jury, move from the cult's group to the group of his family's lawyers and sit with them for a while, he or she would almost suddenly, within a matter of hours or less, return significantly to the pre-cult self. That doesn't mean the whole cult self was removed, but there was something about the very doubling process that kept available elements of that prior self.
Yeah.
that I thought was a subject worth looking at because, as intense as cultic indoctrination can be, it has a kind of limitation and it can be surprisingly uh, rejected or reversed in situations. And I don't think people stop to realize how many eventually come out of cults and move to a different direction, and how many cults end or change, or it isn't simply a static matter, but it's a dynamic and changing one. And the doubling is a process that probably bears more study in relation to cults, and probably provides openings for that alternate life that people need when they come out.
I'm really glad you talked about that, and I'm remembering you were involved with Patty Hearst's case
Yes.
way back in the 70s. But I just want to talk about something that I've been, speaking loudly about, but I would love to get your potential endorsement to this strategy. But this this idea of people cutting off contact with family members and friends who are Trumpers, I tell them no. Just like someone's in Scientology or the Moonies, you want to have more contact with them. You want normal contact with them. You want to invite them over for dinner. Have more things that bring out who they were before the group.
Well, it could be, Steve, that there is a, that is probably partially true for Trump followers. That is, there's a group of Trump followers who are open to the world in some degree,
Mhm.
but saw in Trump somebody who spoke to them uh, in a way that nobody had before, who in some way embodied their sense of being outsiders in society or whatever. But then there's another group, much more fanatical, and many of them are white supremacists, who inviting to dinner wouldn't do much good with, and they probably wouldn't come to dinner. But that in between group could well be changeable, and they're the ones who are already undergoing change now, many of them at least questioning. So there is a fanaticism that uh, defies intervention, and it's a waste of time to spend a lot. The people are not open, but at a certain time, some of them might give signals of being open. So you see interviewed on television various people who begin to say, well, I didn't like what Trump did about these briefings, that he didn't use the doctors more about the virus.
Hmm.
But I'll still vote for him. So
Hmm.
when people say that, they're beginning to doubt and they're open to influence. And yes, then I think what you say is very true. One should not avoid contact with them.
Right. Well,
But
you.
then when a core base of militants who are violent, and many of them, they can be militia people and they can be fanatical in one way or another, then that's not indicated.
So you're agreeing with me, believe it or not, with my thesis in my book, The Cult of Trump, that there are actual cult groups that are following Trump because their leaders say God wants Trump to be president and lead us, or he's the true leader of the white race, or whatever. But so there are cult groups, but I would make the distinction between people born into cults versus people who are recruited into a cult, and then that cult is in the cult of Trump. So it can be more complex in terms of being able to get out.
If you're born into the, I don't know what it would mean to be born into the the. I think if you're born into the Trump movement, it's not quite the same as the cultism of Trump, as you know, uh, differs from what we're used to, in that there's no single immediate community that is controlled by the guru, with reality and truth being controlled and assigned. by the guru, but
Right.
rather there are different groups all over the country who rally round Trump. And it could be that the, the low numbers at the rally last night suggest the falling off of this, although we should not be too quick to count Trump out. And I'm sure he'll have a massive turnout at his next rally. But when you're born into that group, or when you grow up in it, it may be full of some confusions to a greater extent than with controlled individual communities of
Yeah, for sure.
traditional cults.
For sure. No,
And in that
Trump.
sense,
No, go
yeah,
ahead.
in that sense, people around Trump, some people around Trump, young people, younger people, or the children of people who are for Trump, may be approachable and amenable
Yeah,
to
exactly.
change.
No, I was going to just say that Trump has been around too short a time for anyone to be born into the cult of Trump. One could
Yes,
have
yes,
parents who
yes.
are believers and you're a kid, but it's very short-lived. I wonder if I can shift and just ask you, because you talked about thought reform, you made a conscious choice, and we're going to be wrapping up momentarily. You made a conscious choice when you wrote your seminal book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. The subtitle was A Study of Brainwashing in China. You made a conscious choice not to put brainwashing at the top and to use thought reform. And I wonder if you could opine on terminology like brainwashing, thought reform, coercive persuasion, which Edgar Schein used for his book, undue influence, which is a legal concept. What are your thoughts about words that might work to describe what we're
Well,
talking about?
uh, I can particularly talk about the first two, thought reform and brainwashing. Um, yes, I put brainwashing in my subtitle, but in quotes,
Right.
because I wanted to show that it was not a legitimate term, but
Mhm.
one you couldn't get rid of because it was everywhere, used by people mainly, uh, and thought reform, in contrast, was rarely used.
Mhm.
So I try to distinguish between them by saying that thought reform is the particular term the Chinese use for their process of changing people, changing their ideas, and I would say their identity in a very important way. Brainwashing is the popular term for what the Chinese do, but it's become a loose term and of little use when you want to say anything with precision. So, in a way, brainwashing is used in just a casual way. Uh, if somebody you knew changed his mind in a way you didn't like it, you would say, well, he was brainwashed by his mother or his father or the group he was in. It then means something someone told him that you didn't like, or uh, brainwashing has no legitimacy as a concept, but
Mhm.
it's a popular image. And
Mhm.
sometimes brainwashing includes an image of a process that's a weird and absolutely oriental, a form of oriental knowledge that can't be resisted.
Uh-huh.
It's and of course, in the early days, the CIA half thought that way and wanted part of it, uh, wanted part of it for themselves.
Yeah, MK
In any case,
Ultra and all that.
yeah, brainwashing goes from any extreme to another, and it's just a popular term that is applied to the slightest amount of influence to an imagined, fictitious, uh, all-encompassing assault on the mind. Whereas thought reform describes a particular process that I could talk about in detail in
Hmm.
my book, and that's what the book was about. So when we talk about general tendencies in society, we do better to talk about thought reform and then way in which I relate thought reform to cultist developments that
Uh-huh.
can be in a religious or political mode.
Uh-huh.
Those two would be. And coercive persuasion, Edgar Schein really meant, I guess, general forms. of persuading people under pressure of coercion. Uh, but I can't say I followed in detail his later work as to how he developed it. And what was the last term?
No, undue influence is a legal term that's been around for 500 years in British law of exploiting one party exploiting another for their betterment. And that,
Yes.
I'm exploring
Well,
using that
yes,
term more.
I can't say I've done much work in that area, but in that sense, it's interesting that there's a place in law over the centuries for a group that's um, coercive in its influence, potentially coercive, if it's called undue influence. It's potentially coercive toward others. And that I think is worth noting because um, there are two, as I say elsewhere, there are two false views of thought reform. Uh, One is that it doesn't exist because
Right.
it's just uh, people trying to convince others, and Lifton is making an undue fuss about it. And the other is it's an absolute form of controlling and changing the mind that can't be resisted. And of
Right.
course, that's wrong too. Actually, I say in my book, there are real limitations, and I'm sure you found it too, to
Yep.
thought reform or cultist extremism, because you never can own reality.
Right.
That's the beauty about the world. There are all kinds of things in it that no individual or group can fully control. And the existence of what I called factual, immediate reality is something that we have ways of establishing and proving.
Hmm.
Uh, and these can refute uh, efforts to claim false reality or false narratives. And in that way, the study of thought reform can teach us things beyond those thought reform programs, teach us that we are not pawns to those who, with coercion and force, claim to own reality, but we have potential outlets and connections and traditions that, in an opposite way, see reality as multiple and mixed and nuanced. Uh, and what I would finally say about that is that what you brought up at the beginning, one reason why Trump is so dangerous in his effort to destroy existing institutions in what I call Nazi-like Gleichschaltung, breaking them down and recreating them, in his case, in Trumpist form. One reason why that's so dangerous is that democracy depends upon, to a considerable degree, an openness to reality and the inability of any group to own reality. And
Mm.
these institutions, at least at their best, and at least partially, always had some connection to reality, which Trump wants to destroy, and which our whole society has to struggle to prevent that destruction.
Right, and we need information. We need a free press, as you talk about milieu control and control of communication being so central to thought reform. If we don't have a free press that can criticize Trump and what's happening and inform people, then we're really in trouble in a democracy.
Absolutely. And there are still, and one should not forget it, significant number of Americans in important places remaining in some of these institutions that we've mentioned or in some public sphere where they can reassert not just truths that correct Trump's lies and falsehoods, but can assert the can assert a means of and can illustrate and can be models for responding to reality, being open to truth, and committing oneself to truth. That's still active in our society, and we've got to support it in every way we can, in our case, from the psychological side.
Yeah. So thank you so much for taking the time to share once again your knowledge, your wisdom, your decades of experience. As we wrap up, are there any last thoughts you'd like to add? It was a robust conversation.
I would just sum up what I've been saying uh, in pointing out that we're at a very grave and significant moment now, a turning point. There has been uh, an explosion of commitment to reality and truth and opposition to oppression in all areas that nobody expected. It's extremely important that we take advantage of this moment, uh, see it as very hopeful, though still having lots of dangers, and that we as psychologists look to what we can provide and what we can do to spread understanding of this moment and of the society's behavior in general.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to end holding up your latest book again called Losing Reality. And I might add, it will help you find reality if you've lost reality by, by studying this book. And stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll talk again soon, I hope. Thank
And
you
you stay
very
healthy
much.
as well.
Okay.